session preparing for district visits as part of the virtual Catholic Social Ministry Gathering. I'd like to start off with a prayer. Ask you all, wherever you are, to just take a second and calm yourself, and then I will open us with a prayer by Pope Francis. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace.
Amen. And Bill, thank you for sharing with us that beautiful prayer by Pope Francis. Everyone, we're going to do this briefing in three approximately 10-minute segments, and then we will have questions at the end. However, as your questions arise in your mind, you can use the chat function, which is on the right side of your screen, to share your questions, and we'll be then fielding those questions in the second half of our time together. You know, hundreds of Catholic leaders throughout the country are going to be making these district wonderful way to keep alive our annual tradition of making visits to congressional offices. Usually we do it at the Catholic Social Ministry Gathering, but as you know, there is no gathering this year in 2017. Although 2018 there will be one. It's going to be February 3rd through the 6th, so we'll be back in Washington. We'll be doing the visits there. So what are we doing? We're concerned Catholics, we're concerned citizens, we're not experts, and we're going to bring our concerns to our members of Congress. First issue up is strengthening poverty-reducing international assistance. For the bishops, the budget is a moral document. We have to urge Congress to shine the light of help and assistance on dark situations of poverty, of despair, of refugees, of conflict. And so you'll see that on your on the message to Congress, which you all have, hopefully, together with a chart of international assistance that we also have in your packets, that you will be working to preserve and strengthening reducing development and humanitarian assistance. There's this fund called the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund, OCO. These contingency operations. If you just pull that up a little further on the screen, you'll be able to see that. That's the second talking point that I'm referring to. If that gets eliminated and they don't have that separate fund, we hope that those funds, we expect that those funds, and we need those funds to go into the regular international assistance accounts because the needs are still going to be there. We need conscience protections to assure that faith-based organizations can serve the common good in the international arena. We need increased assistance because of the record number of forcibly displaced people in the world. So that means, disaster assistance, migration assistance, refugee accounts. And then, we need to support the Green Climate Fund to help poor countries adapt to and mitigate climate change. And we need to invest much, much more in peacekeeping programs and conflict prevention programs. Our nation invests enormous amounts of money in military interventions and not nearly enough money in preventing conflict in the first place. Now, why is the church concerned about these issues? we're concerned about, the bishops are concerned about them because they believe that international assistance advances human dignity, it reduces conflict, it creates opportunity in our world in the place of hopelessness. We have broad experience of this. The church all over the world, through Catholic relief services and local Caritas agencies, does amazing work all around the world. And so we can talk about that experience to our members of Congress. And poverty is not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. That international assistance makes our world more secure at the same time that it does the right thing, helping people in need. You know, the whole foreign assistance budget that we care about, the poverty-focused area, the poverty-reducing area, is $22.7 billion. That's less than that's about half a percent of the overall federal budget. The average American, what percentage of the federal budget is spent on international assistance? They say, oh, it's 25%. Then you ask them what it should be, and they say, oh, it should be about 10%. It's a half a percent. They're very open to preserving and protecting that tiny fraction of the budget that does so much good around the world. I'm not going to go into any more details on that. I'm going to ask my colleague Bill to and just explain to you some of what this assistance actually does.
That was extremely helpful. I would like to call your attention to the chart that's labeled International Poverty Reducing Development and Humanitarian Accounts that Steve is holding up. I'm not going to go through each of these accounts. I think that would be take us too long. But I'm going to talk about some groups of these categories of funding to give you a sense of what they do and why they're important. So the first 6 lines are really around global health. And the first 3, maternal and child health, nutrition, and vulnerable children, are all directed at helping the most vulnerable children and women in the context of families around the world. Account. Malnutrition in the first 1,000 days of a child's life can permanently prevent them from reaching their cognitive and physical potential. That's called stunting. As we make our efforts to address global poverty, investing in nutrition helps children to take care of their kids in a way where they reach their full potential. And those first 1,000 days are absolutely critical so that they can grow up to be fully functional, contributing members of their society. So those first 3 accounts have to do with children. The next 3 have to do with diseases, particularly HIV and AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, and other diseases like Ebola, for example. This assistance is truly life-saving, and Catholic Relief Services has been involved, particularly around HIV and malaria. As part of the PEPFAR program, which is the International Anti-HIV program, CRS alone has helped over 265,000 people who otherwise would have died, unable to care for their families, unable to contribute to their societies. These 3 accounts are truly life-saving and enabling people to respond to diseases in the communities where they live and to live productive lives. The next account is called Development Assistance, which is really a catch-all for the water, sanitation, and other key building blocks that villages and communities need in order to thrive. And so those responses are combined in the development assistance. Education, for example, as you would imagine, all families want to educate their children. It's the top priority of the kids, of the families and the mothers and the fathers that I've met in my travels around the CRS world. The next 3 lines have to do with refugees and disasters. So international disaster assistance, migration refugee assistance, and emergency refugee and migration assistance. Our country is a very generous leader in assisting who are subject to natural and man-made disasters. And I'll just focus on the Middle East. These accounts are helping people who have fled Syria, the terrible conflict there, into the neighboring countries, assisting them as refugees, assisting displaced Iraqis in Iraq, and assisting in the whole range of humanitarian needs and then short-term needs like shelter, livelihoods, clothing, food, the things that all human beings need. Skip down to the contributions to international peacekeeping activities and peacekeeping operations. That with the Atrocities Prevention Board and Complex Crises Fund. One of the things that the church has been very strong on, and certainly the Holy Father has been strong on, is the need to prevent wars. Our government has a number of very strong programs that are underfunded but are designed conditions that lead to conflict, or to, in the case of the peacekeeping operations, to inject the United Nations or other force in between warring parties in order to separate them and allow them to work out their differences in through a political process. These accounts are absolutely critical. The poorest of the poor are not victims of conflict because, as you would imagine, in war, the poor are the first victims, and in modern day conflict, frankly, it's rarely the soldiers who are harmed, it's usually the innocent civilians. Finally, I'll just mention two other things. The Green Climate Fund, which is the international response to the Paris Climate Agreement, and our collective effort to ensure that those who least contributed to global warming, that's the poor, suffer for it. And finally, the accounts around anti-trafficking. There's a variety of programs that are critical to ensuring that our nation prevents trafficking, responds to it, and meets the needs of people who have been affected by it. Sense for some of these programs and the good that they do in the world. And thanks so much for your interest.
Thank you. So we just heard from Bill O'Keefe from Catholic Relief Services, and before him, Steve Kalecki from the Office of International Justice and Peace from USCCB, discussing the International Aid Ask. I'm Ashley Feasley. I'm the Director of Policy for Migration and Refugee Services within the Bishops' Conference, and I'm going to speak to you today about our ask relating to refugee resettlement and the treatment of immigrants and refugees in general. I've been asked before I begin to say that there's the live chat function on the right-hand side of our screen that you can submit questions, and at the end of our talking segment, we're gladly going to answer them. I also ask that while this is also an online portion, that you'll use the hashtag CSMG district visits, one word. We urge you to participate and join into the discussion as we are live. So today I'm here to discuss with you refugee resettlement. Many of you have seen the articles in the news and on the television and on social media, so it's pretty much a topic of national discussion right now. Before we get into the particulars of our ask for our in-district CSMG visits, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Refugee Resettlement Program and the invaluable role that the Catholic Church plays in resettling of refugees around the world. Currently, we have 65 million individuals who are displaced or facing some sort of forced migration in the world. It's a time that is seeing increased need for services for those seeking refuge and fleeing persecution. The United States government has a refugee resettlement program that is a model private-public partnership that was begun in an ad hoc manner in the late 1970s and was formally engaged with the government with the Refugee Act in 1980. Since that time, the Catholic Church has been a steadfast partner with the government to resettle over 3 million refugees. The Catholic Church has served refugee families both overseas and here in the United States, both through its work with Catholic Relief Services, the International Catholic Migration Committee, and then on the domestic side is Catholic Charity Partners in the United States. Currently, the Catholic Church resettles approximately 24% of the annual amount of refugees that come to our country. Framework in mind, I'm going to talk a little bit about the refugees that we work every day to assist and integrate into our country. Last year, the president, who determines the number of refugees that will come to the country, set a request of 85,000 refugees, with 10,000 specifically coming from the war-torn and impoverished country of Syria. And the U.S. government, with its partners, among them the Catholic Church, fell just 5 shy of that goal, resettling 8,995 refugees. With that in mind, the presidential determination for this year, which had been set by President Obama, was set for 110,000 refugees. It is with the turn of the administration that we've seen a change in the policies with which what we're seeing in regards to refugees. On January 27th, the new administration signed an executive order that has radically altered the refugee resettlement program as we know it, and has eroded and displaced years of bipartisan work resettling refugees. One of the provisions calls for a halt of refugee resettlement for 120 days. Another provision sets forth a complete ban on resettling Syrian refugees. There are other provisions that are very troubling, including the fact that the number of refugees for this year will no longer be the 110,000 number designated by the prior administration, but will now be 50,000 total. Given the fact that we're seeing an unprecedented time of global displacement and those seeking refuge, this is very, very disturbing, and I think undermines years of important work that has been done both by our government to support and aid refugees, but also by the Catholic Church, who has been a steadfast does this work for a number of reasons. Many of them have to do with the importance of sisters who are migrants and treating them as human children of God. Another element that drives the mission of the Catholic Church to resettle refugees has to do with the fact that Catholic social teaching calls for the right for all those who are fleeing persecution to migrate. It gives them the right to seek refuge and also seek safety and security for their families. It's within this lens that the refugee program has been oriented, both by the Catholic Church and by the U.S. government. You're going to be going on in-district visit meetings. You are going to be speaking to policymakers who are undoubtedly going to be addressing this issue at this time. It's impossible for these individuals not to have heard on the news or been forced to discuss this, whether in the media or in other avenues. It's very important that you explain the importance of this life-saving program as a Catholic, and also as someone who understands the value of refugees in your community and the importance with which refugee resettlement has aided so many over the years, as well as aided and improved our church. Turn to our message to Congress. We have a couple asks that I'm going to go through relating to the executive order. We ask, first off, that you urge President Trump and you urge the lawmakers that you are visiting to rescind the January 27th, 2017 executive order on refugee resettlement. Now, currently, as you may know, there's quite a bit of issues relating to whether this order is going to move forward. The situation is fluid. So I will say to you that right now, the refugee order is not currently being implemented, but it does not mean that later on today, when the Ninth Circuit court case is heard about the temporary restraining order, or what's known as a pause or halt on the legal action, that we will not see a reinstatement of this order. That's why it's incredibly vital that you ask your lawmaker to urge the president to rescind the executive order, and also that you urge your lawmaker to be receptive to legislative efforts that would go to undo the existing provisions of the executive order. The other two provisions that I'm going to ask of you are a little bit more complicated, but are equally important. The first is that we may not receive a rescinded executive order. The Ninth Circuit may allow the president to move forward with his plans to completely alter the resettlement. If that's the case, it's extremely important that you start to advocate to ameliorate or improve some of the existing provisions of the executive order. One such provision that we ask that you mention with your lawmaker is the fact that we must resettle all refugees from all parts of the world, from all religions, based on vulnerability, based on fleeing persecution, and based on their need, not based on their nationality or religion. It's an inherent and very important element of religious liberty that we as Catholics hold dear. The last element that I would ask you to speak to your lawmaker about in relation to the executive order is that we're asking for admission for 75,000 refugees for the rest of this fiscal year. This is a very plausible ask, and there are many reasons why it is possible for our government to continue resettling at this rate as opposed to the 50,000 rate that has been set by the executive order. One reason is that we have existing funding to do that. But most importantly, we have great need in this world. There are those who are fleeing persecution. They do not understand executive orders. They just understand the need and the constant humanitarian risk that their lives are facing as they wait to see if they can find refuge. That you feel free to ask questions, as I've just explained a lot of things, and you certainly will have questions. But please note that Migration and Refugee Services Department is here, whether in this webinar or otherwise, to answer your questions in the coming days. And we thank you for your
Thank you, Ashley. Appreciate that very much. I'm Mark Berlina, direct the Office of Domestic Social Development at the USCCB, and I'll just do the reminders that all my colleagues have done here, that you can input your questions in the chat function, and also the hashtag CSMG district visits during our time here together. On the domestic side, our topic is improving health and healthcare, and this, I'm sure you've heard a lot in the news, read a lot perhaps in the newspapers about what's going on with the Affordable Care Act. And right now, I think it's safe to say there's a lot of guesswork, some lack of clarity exactly what's going to be coming. But there is a sense of urgency from the administration, as well as the Republicans in Congress regarding the Affordable Care Act. It certainly was a significant part of the recent campaigns. So without getting too technical, Congress has, through a process called budget reconciliation, for repeal of certain provisions of the Affordable Care Act. So we know that's coming. Only provisions relating to the financial aspects, those that impact the financial aspects of. So we're looking at an extended period of time to tackle some of the other issues relating to the ACA. But what's clear is we're going to be having conversations about the Affordable Care Act very soon, and we expect to see things on the horizon. We've heard that a plan is coming, both from Congress and from the president, and there's a number of ideas that have been floating. There's actually no shortage of different concepts for a replacement plan. We actually don't have any idea which one's going to be chosen now, but there are some we at the USCCB and other partners have been studying. So we just don't know what's going to be formally adopted. So at this time, it's important to really root ourselves in the church's position on this, what the USCCB has said, what church tradition has held up Catholic social teaching, so that we can go into the offices during your visits and really make a concerted effort to say what's important from a moral perspective. And for the church, the Catholic bishops are not healthcare technicians, and nor do they desire to be, but they have consistently to adequate health for all people, that safeguards and affirms human life and dignity from conception to natural death. And they've done this for many decades, long before the Affordable Care Act was a conversation. Really, the concept is rooted in the idea that proper medical care is a key component for human flourishing. It allows people to really contribute to the common good, participate in society, raise their families, and really reach their full thriving. And these are concepts that are really rooted again in our Catholic social teaching. St. John the 23rd made clear, Pacem Terris, that medical care is a right. And we've had that echoed by Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI. Pope Francis recently said, health indeed is not a consumer good, but a universal right, which means that access to healthcare services cannot be a privilege. And that's really where the bishops are in this concept. So going back to the original passage of the Affordable Care Act, it was a complex circumstance, and while the bishops supported the general goal of the law to expand medical coverage for many poor and vulnerable people, and they still do, the USCCB ultimately opposed the Affordable Care Act because it expanded the role of the federal government in funding and facilitating abortion and plans that cover abortion, and it failed to provide essential conscience protections and access to health care for immigrants. So the concept of getting increased access for those, especially those most in need, was still very much in the minds of the bishops, despite these obstacles and what ultimately caused them not to be able to support the law. Based on the new reality, now that there are millions of people who have received healthcare coverage and are relying on it for their health and their well-being, Bishop Duane, who is the chairman of the Committee on Domestic Justice and Human Development, wrote to Congress recently, and this letter really forms the basis for what we're going to be asking you to take into the offices of your legislators. And this is, if we can share here in a minute, the section of the Hill notes that cover healthcare. Really, what we're asking you to take to legislators is this: to really couple that repeal effort, if it's going to happen, with the concept of replacement that ultimately protects access to truly affordable healthcare for all, and protects the gains in healthcare coverage that have come about for millions of Americans since the passage of the Affordable Care Act. Uncertainty for those, especially those who may choose between food and gas for getting jobs and their healthcare. Uncertainty at this time would really be a devastating reality. But it's important that we also have a chance to go back and fix those aspects of the Affordable Care Act that need to be fixed from the first go-round. So also looking to ask our legislators to protect human life in whatever plans come forward. And that includes prohibitions on the federal government funding or facilitating abortion and plans that cover abortion. It also really focuses on that vital conscience protections for individuals, entities, healthcare providers, and healthcare professionals as they try to bring their beliefs into the workplace in vital areas. And then finally, that it ensures access to coverage for immigrants and their families. The previous concern really focused on that 5-year delay period for any immigrants being able to access Medicaid and other medical programs at the federal level. And of course, folks who are, these are lawful permanent residents who are awaiting citizenship. They pay taxes, contribute to the economy, and we feel that very strongly the bishops feel that them contributing into the process, as well as having access to vital healthcare, is important for them, and actually helps society overall in terms of other programs. So just a few things as I wrap up here that I think we want to be clear about. The bishops' conference is in a wait-and-see mode about specifics relating to any replacement plan, so it's not necessary to engage in deep conversations about tax credits or other aspects of none of those have been formally introduced, and really we're talking about a moral framework for the healthcare law. And the bishops have not changed their position from the original passage of the ACA, but they cannot ignore the changed realities of those who are now covered, so particularly the poor and the vulnerable, so that we ought not leave them in the lurch. That's a very key concept. Congress has an opportunity in a bipartisan way to honor the moral principles that are outlined by the Church and work towards access to truly affordable healthcare for all people. And again, in some of these areas, all different aspects of what we talked about, it can get highly technical, and we just ask not to get too weedy. You can always refer them to our offices. We're engaging at a very substantive level at some of these things, but you're here to talk about your belief as a Catholic person of good faith, and we think that that perspective is very important. So with that, I think we're ready to take some questions.
We are ready to take some questions. I was very grateful to Ashley for introducing me, since I forgot to introduce myself. I am Steve Kolecki. I direct the Office of International Justice and Peace here at the Bishops' Conference. We'll start off with a couple of quick questions that were asked of international, and then we'll go to Ashley for some from MRS. But let's start here. This is the first question we received. Are we going to get into percentages of spending and amounts that need to be spent rather than what the goal and objective? Are leaders to find a way to, therefore, to accomplish that goal or objective? And my answer to that question is we have to do both. The budget is a moral document. It defines our priorities. If there's a radical cut in funding, even if it's doing the right things, it will not match the need that is actually out there, the needs of people fleeing for their lives, the needs of people living in crushing poverty, the needs of people who require HIV, AIDS drugs in order to stay alive, antiretroviral drugs in order to stay alive. So, yes, we need to mention that this is a very tiny portion of the budget. Good, and it needs to be fully funded, and it needs to be fully funded for the very purposes that Bill outlined as he went through this. Don't forget your chart. Make sure you leave the chart in the office for them as well, in addition to the message to Congress. I'm your visual effects person here, apparently. And Bill, I think there was another question on international that related to a comment you made.
Sure. Add to what you said.
Please.
What I would do if I were in your place walking into these meetings on the international issues is I would start by making the moral and personal case of why these U.S. role in helping the poor around the world is important to you, to your parish, to your diocese, to your institution. I would say, the budget is a moral document, as we've discussed, and we have put together a list of accounts that we think are particularly important at levels that we think are the minimum. And then I would pick out maybe one or two that are of particular interest to you, to your community. For example, you could talk about how concerned you are about the refugees fleeing Syria and how important it is that our country assists them in Lebanon and Jordan and Turkey. You could talk about you are so concerned about children and that your parish has a particular ministry around children and that you feel that we need to do more to help children around the world reach their potential. So you make kind of the overall argument by handing them the chart and just saying, these are our request. Maybe you pick out one or two where you try to bring it alive and personalize it a little bit. Volunteer, for example, talk about the country. If you have a refugee from a particular country who's told your parish about conditions in their country, talk about that country. Make it real and show why you really care as a citizen. Specific question, someone asked about the term that I had used for when kids don't have adequate nutrition and then how their development is stunted, and the term is stunting. And it's a really terrible condition that results from chronic malnutrition and permanently prevents that child from reaching their potential.
Yeah, and the stunting, I visited some countries where this is quite prevalent, sadly. And the stunting is not only physical, that they're smaller in stature, but their mental capacities are impaired, and they really do not reach their full potential in so many dimensions of their lives. Ashley, I'm sure we have some questions for MRS.
Sure. So I received a question that said, given the America First priority that has been struck by our current president, what are some of the new strategies for advocating for the global common good? Well, first off, thanks for this question, because I think many of you, as you are going into the offices, are certainly, it's a new administration and there's been a lot of ground that's already been covered that is somewhat, concerning, particularly as it relates to immigrants and refugees. Kind kind of piggybacking off of what Bill had mentioned, it needs to be something personal. You're there and you're the local expert, and it's your job in many ways to make refugees something that it is not about a data point or about a security concern, but about a positive community interaction. So many of you have had positive interactions with refugees, whether you've assisted immigrants or refugees in various capacities in your parish, whether you work in Catholic charities providing services, whether you have seen positive interactions in certain programs and ministries in your churches. It's your job, I think, really here to personalize and make your representative understand that this is something that is not about the politics, but it's about the people. Refugees are people like you and me, and part of our religious duty, frankly, is to care for our brother and sister. The other thing I would say is it's also about America. This is an American program that's a point of pride. It's a public-private partnership that's existed for over 35 years. It's a model that has been emulated around the world. Many times other governments have come to see what we have done. And it's important that you show the pride that you have in that program, as well as putting a face on refugee resettlement. Those are the points I think I would stick with right now. I think it's really important that you be somebody who is an important advocate and ally on a personal level for refugees and refugee resettlement. And we're happy to assist you with follow-up if you'd like them from our office. Another question I received is there any evidence that another executive order is in the works that would target undocumented persons currently living in the United States? So in addition to the executive order on refugee resettlement that was signed by the president on January 27th, there were two other immigration-related executive orders that were signed on the 25th of January, one relating to border security and one relating to interior enforcement. The executive order relating to interior enforcement did actually move to greatly expand the number of undocumented who would be considered priorities for apprehension by this new administration. Section 5 of that executive order lays out new priority categories that rapidly expand who is considered a priority for removal and apprehension. We are in the process, the bishops are deeply concerned about this and are in the process of working with the Department of Homeland Security as well as with Congress to try and minimize and push back on this. What I will say to you about the larger executive order frameworks that are related to immigration is that we have a webinar on the JFI website, the Justice for Immigrants website, that we conducted on Friday of last week. It's a recording that's available along with the slide deck in which all of the immigration and refugee related executive orders are discussed on a webinar format. I encourage you to go to the JFI website to follow up and educate yourself on some of these other executive orders. Again, the website is www.justiceforimmigrants.org. I think Mark has some questions, and then we'll follow up with some of our other questions.
That's great. Thank you, Ashley. Yeah, just a couple here. The first is easiest. Can you share Bishop Dwayne's letter to Congress? That is currently on the website, usccb.org/healthcare. And if you look there, you should be able to find it right at the top. Another question that's not completely unrelated is how completely have the archbishops in each district bought into the JPHD objectives outlined that we just kind of discussed. The bishops' committees are really the way that the USCCB operates, and so the consultation among the committees and the different bishops took place before the letter was sent, of course. And then there was a press release announced all bishops have received the letter and are aware of the USCCB position. I imagine there's specifics in every state, whether your state had a Medicaid expansion or not, that some nuances in your state Catholic conferences that you'll want to take into account when talking about it at the local level. One other question we got here was, what is the distinction between access to healthcare and actual coverage and right to healthcare? Of course, the church teaches that there's a right to healthcare, and that's an important part of recognizing human dignity, human dignity. One of the things that you see sort of a partisan coloring over this right now, where is access a code word to say that we're not going to make it affordable or really give folks in the Medicaid expansion the coverage that they now have received. That's not, the bishops have used the word access since before that really had been an issue, and what they mean is, of course, right now we've sort of solved that issue through the Medicaid program, and those are the folks that need to be protected in this new environment, the coverage they receive. But you also have employer-based healthcare and choices that can be made in that, and folks who may be wealthy enough to cover their own expenses. So. It's different things to different people, but when it comes to the poor and vulnerable, those who have difficulty, the key is the bishops have talked about truly affordable, and for some folks that's they can't afford very much at all, and we want to make sure that those people are protected in the conversations going forward. A couple more. Do you want to do round robin? I got just a real short one. There was during the prep session, we talked a little bit about climate change and stewardship. The question is that something we want to hold our fire on? I don't know that it's entirely useful with the amount of time you're going to have in these offices to add yet another issue, one that's a bit complex. And of course, here at the national level, we're working to try to get a sense of where the administration is on this. If you paid attention to the confirmation hearings, we think there's an opportunity for some dialogue. And then, of course, we're doing all we can to advocate to make sure that the church's teaching on care for the environment, Pope Francis's important message, is heard. So you could almost do a whole separate session on that. So I think it's best probably to leave that aside for now.
Well, except the only thing, Mark, that I would add is under international, you would have an opportunity at least to raise it as an issue, because it is included in our chart of accounts, the Green Climate Fund, funding to mitigate climate change and to develop more resilient communities to adapt to the increased extreme weather events that we are having in terms of droughts and storms. So that would be a way of at least keeping the issue alive, and to talk about how our own country's been experiencing more recent storms and more intensified storms and more intensified droughts and more regular droughts, and the world in vulnerable countries have been experiencing that as well. So it's important to address it, whether all of the changes are human caused or by cycles of nature, whatever. We certainly need to address the issues of resilience. There were a couple of general questions that were raised before we go to other questions. I think we'll, do we have advice on how best to schedule the meeting? The best way to schedule a meeting is actually to call the office rather than sending an email. I would call the office, find out who the scheduler is in that local office, speak to them, tell them you have a group of people who would like to, a group of concerned Catholics that would like to meet with them on a range of issues. Mention the 3 areas that you'd like to discuss, so they can arrange to have the appropriate staff, or Senator himself, or herself in the meeting. Usually they'll have staff meetings, which is not a bad thing, by the way. If you meet with the right staff members, that can be effective. The other question was, how do you get the documents that we've been holding up? We've been, the 2 documents that you need to leave behind, which are the message to Congress and the chart, but also the other documents that provide talking points and many of the points we've been making during this session. They're all available. They've already been emailed to you, but if you haven't received them, Yvonne would be able to send you the documents. You can email her. I'm just going to spell out the email address so you get it exactly right. It's IGUILLEN. That's IGUILLEN at usccb.org. And and Yvonne would be happy to email you all of the various documents. But there's also a link to a Dropbox where you can get them, and eventually they'll also be on the USCCB website. So you should have no trouble getting the documents. We return to a couple of MRS questions and then go to international ones.
Sure.
Sure. So here's a question I received. Is there action afoot to protect DACA applicants from being specifically targeted for deportation? So currently there has been no executive order that has been signed by President Trump that rescinds the existing DACA protection. DACA is currently still in place. There are currently 750,000 individuals who have the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival, DACA. DAPA is not in place. It was overturned. The implementation was overturned by the Supreme Court based on a preliminary injunction, and it is still in the courts. Statements, as has his staff, that he wants to work something out for the DACA individuals. We are very hopeful of that, but more than being hopeful, the bishops are strongly and aggressively advocating to protect DACA applicants. They are very aggressively pushing with the Department of Homeland Security that DACA not be rescinded. They're also offering solutions if DACA were to be rescinded, such as promoting the Bridge Act, which is in the House and the Senate. There is an action alert that you may partake in on the Justice for Immigrants website for the Bridge Act in both the House and the Senate. The bishops have signed a letter of support, and I urge you to please sign up for that if you go to the Justice for Immigrants website. But again, at this time, there is no executive order rescinding DACA, and at this time, DACA applicants are not priority categories for deportation. Another America be impacted by the current executive order, and is there movement to restrict these refugees considering these areas are considered extremely dangerous? Thank you for this question. I think the author of the question understands the root causes issues that my colleagues here from CRS and IJP spend quite a bit of time working on. We are all aware of the violence and the persecution and the issues in the Northern Triangle of Central America. What I will say is I think it depends a lot on what we're talking about here. So the new executive order on border security will prioritize all those who are arriving to the border, whether they're Central Americans, Mexicans, people from other parts of the country, of the world. They will be considered priorities for removal. This is not, by and large, a change from the former Obama administration, as those arriving to the border were considered priorities for an express processing called expedited removal. What is concerning about the executive orders relating to Central Americans is that many of these individuals, as you know, are fleeing persecution and have viable protection claims in the form of asylum or perhaps trafficking or crime victim claims. The new executive order on border security will make those protections so much more difficult for this population to access. We are aware of this issue, and we're working with our Catholic partners and as well as immigrant rights advocates to try and make sure that our immigration system enables those who need to seek protection can do so.
I have a real simple question, then I think, Bill, you might have a couple, and then Mark also. This one's very, very easy. Asking me to explain what is meant by the charge of accounts. Is it a US CCP, CRS, or Congress document? Actually, this is just an articulation problem perhaps on my part. It's a chart of accounts, and it's US CCP and CRS. We created this chart. Accounts listed. These are accounts at the in the foreign assistance accounts that are important to and to CRS. So it's a chart of accounts, and it's a chart we hope you will leave with your congressional office.
Steve, can you just, there was a question about what are the leave behinds. Would you mind just going over again, what are the leave behinds that folks doing visits should leave with whoever they're meeting with?
Sure. There are two documents that you physically leave behind. That's this beautiful heading on it that says, "Call to the Common Good, a Catholic Message to Congress." That, minus all my scribble notes on it, should be left behind.
And that consolidates the main points and asks on all the issues we've discussed.
Right. It's a summary of why we're visiting Congress and then the 3 issue areas. And it's the document that you saw up on the screen periodically showing the various asks. And they're all summarized on a 2-page document. So that's one thing. The second thing you should leave behind is the chart, which is taking on special significance. But it's a chart, and we want you to leave that behind because it includes the detail provide in the overall message. So those 2 things. Now the other, you have talking points to help you prepare ahead of time. Those are for you to help you prepare ahead of time. And there are even some tips on how to set up a meeting and how to orchestrate a meeting. Are also very helpful. Those are all for your background, though. You don't need to leave any of those documents. So, Bill, do you have any other?
Yeah, just 2 quick things. First, I wanted to add on about the question around how to handle this issue about America First. And should you be in a meeting with a legislator or a staff person who says something like, "Everything you're saying makes a lot of sense, but we've got to take care of America first. It's about Americans first." If you come across that, I think there's 2 ways to respond to that. The first is just simply to say that as a Catholic, we have a responsibility to take care of both our own and people outside of our borders, and that we have the means as the richest country in the world to do so. Thing that you might say. And the second thing you might say is that the problem with America First is we might take actions that seem to put America first today, jeopardize America first in the future. We are interested in the long-term stability and security and prosperity of the world, and it's in America's interest, programs like this, to resettle refugees, system that meets the needs of the poor, if we want to contribute to a safer, better world for ourselves and for everybody. To handle the America First issue, which kind of a way of pretending that we do not have responsibilities to the other. And a way of highlighting legitimate needs within our own borders that we need to address. So supporting the poor overseas does not absolve us or the Congress from doing something to help those who have lost their jobs, for example. We had another question about whether there are best practices or resources from the USCCB and CRS about engaging minors, especially high school students, with their local representatives and in incorporating these social justice issues into high school content areas. And we do actually have a bunch of really solid resources. You can look at wearesaltandlight.org, and the Bishops' Conference has some fantastic resources they put together, targeted at all audiences, youth, adults. CRS.org, we have a series of resources for high schools that allow them to get very involved in a range of social justice issues. So thanks for asking that question. That's really, really helpful.
We probably ought to kick this over to domestic, because I noticed that Mark has a number of questions here. But as I do that, someone asked what the CR, the chart, stands for, and it stands for continuing resolution. That the FY17 budget is currently a continuing resolution, and that's what that column refers to. Mark?
A number of these are more general questions. Is there any coordination via USCCB for in-district visits? We asked for the info when they registered, and then also, how will we know who else in our district signed up for this webinar? The answer really is the same. state captains will be reaching out to those who signed up in the days ahead, the next couple of days, to connect with you and make sure you coordinate on timing of the visit and availability. So look for that. And then there's a question which take it to read. I know it is also important to visit. Records don't mirror these views. Any advice on how to approach them? Certainly others can chime in here. I think the important thing is you have good resources here that allow you to have a healthy back and forth, but it's important not to get into an argument. If somebody really wants to press a point, leaving the materials and being clear about the position, but keeping the spirit of the meeting in a good place is very important. The idea is to show that the Catholic community feels very strongly about the issues that are being brought forward, and that there's a respectful way, and that's certainly the approach we take here at the national level, and I think we'd want to make sure that was going on all throughout the country. So
I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions that we have not gotten to yet?
I have a couple
Okay.
that I can quickly get to.
Please.
One is I'm involved with a local secular refugee task force with the members of the local refugee resettlement agency. LIRS is the mentioned agency, which is the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, helping to define talking points. Conflict of interest for me. My response is no. I think that LIRS has been a trusted partner for us. They're also a voluntary agency that works to resettle refugees. They work with us and the Refugee Council USA. I think this issue is so much about community. It's about secular and interfaith groups. It's really about, again, like I said, people. And so I encourage you to continue to be involved, and also to, kind of loop in some of your, fellow parishioners and others maybe into this group to gain part of a little bit more of a Catholic social teaching lens. But thank you generally for your participation.
Just don't you think too that this person has a lot of experience they can then share to support the arguments in these meetings? That sounds like somebody who could be a real resource.
That's right. We've identified you as a leader, so you need to take leadership,
That's right.
certainly for this visit on this issue.
Okay.
As our government is operating on a continuing resolution for federal spending for FY 2017, what level of refugee resettlement support is available under the continuing resolution? So as I stated before, we have funding as it is for 75,000 refugees. That being said, the continuing resolution, only lasts for the next couple months. Basically, we are facing, I think, historic shortfalls, generally for the Office of Refugee Resettlement. The Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is located in the Department of Health and Human Services, does many things, not just refugee resettlement, but helps work with our unaccompanied children. They also provide a number of immigrant and refugee integration programs. Their funding is certainly, I think, tight, and certainly in doubt for after this year. So it is something that we are definitely monitoring and are concerned about, and need your support generally as it relates to refugee resettlement, but also as it relates to that request for 75,000 for this year.
We have another question on the famous chart. So here's your chart. They've just asked me to explain across the top what the different columns mean. The first column is, of course, all of the accounts that are listed. There's OCO included is noted at the top. OCO is that overseas account that I told you about, that if it gets that separate fund is, if Congress does away with it, then they need to, we hope, continue to include those resources in these accounts. The first column after that, the FY Omnibus, that is the FY 16 Omnibus budget that was passed by Congress. Those are the numbers. It totals to $22.7 billion. Our request for FY 17, $4.6 billion altogether, and that, though, you can see the amounts in that column. The final column is the continuing resolution, to about $23.7 billion. So we're requesting more than the continuing resolution provided. And the continuing I mean, they can still change that, and that will, so you can see that. And I had a particular question that was asked about international disaster assistance, which we're going to have to look into. I noticed that the continuing resolution has a higher number than our request. Unusual for our chart. So we'll double check on that and get back to you. But for now, this chart should be fine. If we have a new one, you'll get it in your email.
Just a reminder to, as you're making your visits, to use the hashtag CSMG district visits. We'd love to see pictures and notes about your visits. And then we'll see you in person February 3rd to the 6th, 2018 here in Washington, D.C.
For the Catholic Social Ministry Gathering, where you can make your on the Capitol Hill rather than in the districts. But don't underestimate the importance of these district visits. They're enormously important. Thank you so much for your time.